Hello, welcome to my channel. Here's my colored pencil drawing of two F-18 planes of the Blue Angels exhibition team. We're going to get right into it. I'm going to be using these Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and I'm going to be working on 9x12 inches smooth drawing paper. And I already started working on the background, as you can see, so I'm going to explain the drawing process and how I approached this drawing. So like I said, these two F-18s are a part of the flight demonstration team Blue Angels, and these are not the same. One of them is a Super Hornet and the other one is the one closer to us. The one at the bottom is the regular Hornet. And I'm doing the background, like I said. Now, colored pencils are a very slow medium, and you have to work patiently and you have to build up the tone and the value gradually, otherwise you're going to get some ugly texture. I'm not a very patient person, but I try to layer and build up this blue tone slowly and gradually. And as for blending, they can be blended a little bit, and I mostly used a Q-tip and a brush for blending. These two things move the pigment a little bit, so it's not like you can't blend it at all, but it is a little bit difficult to blend. That's why you need to be careful when laying down your pencil. You need to try not to produce an ugly looking texture. But if you're patient enough, you can build up a nice looking blue tone. And by the way, the pencil that I used for the sky is a light phthalo blue. I also decided to have some clouds in there, and now that I've defined the upper edge of some of those clouds, I'm breaking those clouds into smaller shapes. I'm trying to define some smaller shapes within those clouds, within those larger shapes, and I'm doing this by adding some shadow areas using that same light phthalo blue. And I'm kind of going to fade the bottom edge of those clouds. As for the sketches of the planes, these are not very complex, other than the letters US Navy, because it's a US Navy flight exhibition team. So working around that would be a pain, so I did that part using the tracing method. So the sketch was done using a combination of freehand and tracing, so that I could speed up and simplify some parts of this process. Using a combination of tracing and freehand is usually my favorite method whenever I have subjects that are a little bit more complex. But for some other subjects like landscape and animals, I usually do pretty much all of it freehand. Here I'm going to do the rest of this in freehand. I'm not going to use any rulers, but I'm going to try to obtain straight lines just by being careful, I guess. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is just an artistic rendition of these two fighter planes, so it's not a technical sketch or anything. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm cleaning up the edge around the tip of the wing here, and now I'm going to start coloring the main part of the wing, and I'm going to start working around these letters here. Sorry for my head butting in every now and then. The thing is that even though my camera was adjusted pretty well here, sometimes I just have to move in a little bit closer to when I'm drawing these smaller details, because some parts of this process can be a little bit delicate. So for the color of the plane, I use a combination of phthalo blue and a Prussian blue. I'm gonna layer the Prussian blue over the phthalo blue. Maybe eventually they ended up being a little bit too light. Maybe I should have used some other combination, but the thing is that I also have a limited number of colors I don't have a large set of these polychromos pencils. I just buy them individually, and these are the two that I chose to use, and I'm mostly going to use the Prussian blue to layer over the phthalo blue, and I'm also going to use it for the shadow areas. I'm going to use quite a bit more of it and a little bit more pressure for the shadow areas, and I'm even going to use some black for some of the darkest shadow areas. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Right now, like I said, I'm working around these letters, and this is of course a little bit difficult, and I already messed it up a little bit and I had to do a bit of erasing. Now, as for these yellow parts, I used two yellows. Actually, this is the regular yellow, and the other one is kind of like an orange yellow. I'm not really sure what it's called in the Faber-Castell range, but I use that for the letters because those yellowish parts on the planes, they're not exactly yellow from what I can see from the reference photos. They're something in between orange and yellow. It's not exactly orange, it's kind of like a yellowish orange. So I'm going to try to imitate that color. The colors don't have to be exactly the same. I mean, I don't have a problem with them being slightly off. I'm not doing one of those scale models where I have to get the exact same paint. I have assembled a couple of model kits, plastic model kits of planes. The first one I did was Mirage 2000, and the second one was F-16. The F-16 was slightly smaller, I think. I'm not really sure. I think the Mirage may have been 1:72 scale. I'm not really sure. Anyway, I'm trying to define some of the edges of the clouds. Basically trying to break up that blue area into some clouds and make the background a little more interesting. Now, in the reference photo that I worked off of, there was a horizon and an ocean down below. So I didn't really like that. I didn't really like that line of the horizon. It didn't really fit into my idea of the composition, so I decided to go for a simpler composition with some clouds and the sky behind these planes. And I also changed the position of the planes a little bit, just so that I could get a slightly more balanced composition. Now, as I've already mentioned, these are not the exact same type of planes. The one at the top is a Super Hornet. That's like the improved, advanced version of the plane. And its appearance is mostly different from what I can tell because of these intakes that you can see. They have a square shape or angular shape, while the intakes on the regular Hornet are more rounded. Other than that, I don't really see any major differences in the appearance of these two fighter planes. So once again, back to what I was saying about drawing the sky. It takes quite a bit of patience. You can't use too much pressure all at once. You kind of have to build it up gradually, because if you use too much pressure, you will create too much texture, and it will be difficult to remove that texture. This way, when I'm kind of layering it gradually and building up that tone gradually, I'm able to use my blending tools and make everything smoother, and then add a little bit more on top, and then blend a little bit, and then add a little bit more on top. So this takes a bit more time, but the end result looks a little bit better. With pastels, pastels and pastel pencils, this would obviously be a lot faster, but then again, with pastels, things would be a lot messier. I would have to use a different type of paper, and it would also be a lot more difficult and messier to draw all these tiny details and letters and insignia on these planes, which I don't like doing in pastels. Colored pencils are a lot cleaner, they allow for a lot more precision and accuracy, they can be sharpened a lot better and more easily. So I found that for the main subject here, the two main subjects, the fighter planes, the colored pencils were a much better choice. I could have done a combination of pastel and colored pencils. That would have also worked, but since I was in no hurry, I did the background using colored pencils. But like I said, it will require, if you choose this option, it does require a little bit more patience. So now I'm using that yellowish orange to go over these letters, because I thought that they looked a little bit too yellow. I wanted more of an orangey tone, and I'm kind of hoping I will modify the color a little bit. The entire drawing process was around 4 hours, I think. Not because the drawing is so complex, obviously I've done much more complex drawings, but because colored pencils can be a little bit slow to work with, so it takes a while to cover and layer all of these areas. That's just the way it is. You have to accept some of the limitations of the medium that you're working with. And with the limitations there are also some advantages, so that's the way it always is. And the size of the drawing is not terribly large, my usual favorite format, so overall it didn't really take that long to finish. I'm still working around these letters, trying to make the edges as clean as possible. There are some grey tones, grey colors here in this intake area. So those are these large angular intakes that I was talking about. The shape is different than on the regular Hornet. And on the exhausts on the other end of the engines, I will also have some greyish tones and some black tones as well. I'm putting in some of these yellowish areas first. Obviously some of them are a little bit more complex than I'm making them right now. I'm not really going to be able to capture all of the details. There's a nice reflection here at the tip of the airplane, of the nose, and I created that highlight by leaving that white space. I'm also trying to refine the shape of the nose area. It's not that easy using freehand, but I just have to try to be careful not to do too much of it at once. I can always go back and add a little bit more later, but erasing can be difficult, so that's why I'm being careful. I'm using this darker Prussian blue for these shadow areas in between these engines and intakes. And I obviously can't make the entire aircraft just blue, because that would make it look flat. I have to try to find a way to explain the shape to the viewer so that the aircraft looks more three-dimensional. And I'm going to do that by trying to create a range of value, and I'm going to be using 2 different blues, and I'm hoping those will be enough, because I'm using a very limited number of colors. I'm not an expert when it comes to colored pencil drawings. I have a lot more experience with charcoal and graphite. So this is not going to look great, but I'm hoping that it'll be good enough, because the main thing that I have to worry about is just a basic shape, the basic range of values, so that I can show the contrast between some of the lighter areas and shadow areas, and I think I'm going to be able to do that with the limited number of pencils that I'm using. I think the background in the sky already looks pretty good. I'm just going to draw a bunch of clouds. And let me tell you something else. One of the reasons why I decided to draw as many clouds as I did was because I didn't want to color in all of the background using that light phthalo blue, because that was a very slow process. So I thought at one point, why wouldn't I just add a bunch of clouds there? It'll make the sky look a lot more interesting, plus it'll make my job a lot easier because I don't have to color in all that area. And that's how I decided to come up with so many clouds. And I think eventually they will also help me create a more interesting and more balanced looking composition. So around these exhausts I added more shadow using that black colored pencil, and I added some more shadow on the intake area as well. I'm just going over some of these yellowish in parts, yellowish insignia, and just putting those in first before I go around them using this phthalo blue. So I'm using two different phthalo blues here. I'm using the regular phthalo blue, the darker one, for the airplane, and I'm using a light phthalo blue for the sky. And then I'm going over the phthalo blue with the Prussian blue to modify the overall tone a little bit. And then for the shadow areas I use a little bit more pressure, and I use only the Prussian blue. That's basically my approach. Already I think you can begin to see some of the shadows around the intake area and at the bottom of those root extensions. And that's good, because that means that the lower part of the hull is starting to pop out a little bit. So I'm starting to define the shape of the aircraft a bit. It's starting to look a little bit more three-dimensional. This is very important because I don't want it to end up looking flat, because then it would look cartoonish and it would look almost like a child's drawing. I want to make something a little bit more realistic with a little bit more depth. And you can't have depth without the range of value and without the shadows. So as for my choice of subjects, I'm doing this as a commission drawing, but I have done a number of drawings of airplanes before, and you have those on my channel. I'm going to put the links in the end screen if you want to check those out. I've done MiG-29, I've done Sukhoi 27, I've done F-16 and Mirage 2000. I've also done F-15. I've done the World War II plane Spitfire, and that's pretty much all of the aircraft that I did so far, if I'm not mistaken. There are also some reflective shiny parts here on the lower part of those intakes, around the edges. So the key to drawing these highlights when you're working with colored pencils is simply to reserve the white spaces. There's no way around it. I mean, it's not that you can't erase colored pencil at all. You can erase it to a certain degree, but if you want really strong highlights with cleaner edges and with a lot of contrast, then the best way to do it is to reserve the white space and work around it. That's just the best way. So when you're working with colored pencils, you're more or less reduced to working from dark to light, and you can't work from light to dark unless you erase Sometimes you can erase some details and then work over them with a lighter pencil, which I demonstrated in the leopard video when I drew those whiskers. But normally you have to reserve the white space. The way to overcome this problem is to work on sanded paper or to apply clear gesso. But clear gesso tends to create a rough surface, which produces a lot of rough texture that can be difficult to control. So that usually doesn't look very good with colored pencils. Sanded papers, especially finer ones, work really well with colored pencils. But I wanted to do this one on regular paper, mostly because of the background. So I had to work the traditional way when you're working with colored pencils, working from dark to light and reserving the white space. You can see that I'm sort of reinforcing the shadow areas with a black colored pencil. Initially I put some of that darker Prussian blue to create some of the lighter shadows, and then I made some darker shadows in the darkest areas using a black colored pencil. So I think I've achieved a little bit more depth now, especially around the intakes and the whole intake to engine area, those whole engine blocks, so that they kind of stand out as separate parts against the wings and the rest of the hull. If you look at the shape of this aircraft, it's very similar to some of the other aircraft that I did a while back. The F-18 also has these root extensions, kind of like MiG-29, and the wings are not that dissimilar, but MiG-29's wings are slightly more swept back. There are also similarities with the horizontal stabilizers as well. It has a double vertical fin as well, but a slightly different shape and in a different angle, placed in a different angle. I can also use a white colored pencil to remove some of the texture in some of the areas. A white colored pencil is a decent blending tool, but you have to keep in mind that it can make areas a little bit lighter. It usually muddies things up a little bit, so it's a decent blending tool with colored pencils. But you have to be aware of the fact that you're burnishing the paper, and it can sometimes be difficult to erase or put details on top of that. But other than that, it can be useful in some situations. So here I'm drawing a little bit more of the sky, covering a little bit more with that light Prussian blue, and blending that with a Q-tip, then a brush, and then adding some more value and adding another layer until I get that to look darker. And I'm also working around the edges of the clouds, because normally the top edge of the cloud is a lot more defined because it stands in contrast against the sky because of the light source, which is usually coming from above, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But in most cases, on a clear day, it is the upper edge of the cloud that is a lot more defined. Here I created a bit more texture, so I'm going to have to do a bit more blending and layering over that to eliminate that. I didn't record all parts of the drawing process. I kind of skipped over some of the boring parts, but the video is long enough as it is, I think. So I did the upper part of the background, and I did the first plane, the Super Hornet, and now I'm moving on to the other one, the one that is in the foreground, closer to the viewer, closer to our viewpoint. And there are some red details there as well, and there's going to be some yellowish details again, some insignia. But this one is a little bit closer, so we're going to be able to see some of the details a bit better. But it's viewed from a completely different angle. So to people who don't really know what the F-18 looks like, it's probably going to look like a completely different aircraft. And I have to work around the edges here again with that light phthalo blue to define that outer edge and to draw a little bit of the sky. And then I can further clean up that edge using erasers and draw the details on the aircraft itself. Some of you may be wondering why I don't use solvents for the background. I just don't. Normally, when I do things like this, I use a combination of pastel and colored pencil. But when I work only in colored pencil, I try to work a little bit more patiently and kind of build up the tone and the color that I like until I get the most out of my colored pencil. But it's a little bit slower than it is, actually it's quite a bit slower than it is with solvents, but I don't really like working in anything other than dry media. Things can get messy, and sometimes there are some unpredictable effects, and I don't really have enough experience with those kinds of materials, so I tend to stick to what I normally do. I may experiment with those eventually, but today is not that day. So I'm drawing in this yellowish orange areas first, and now I'm trying to define the edge between these two vertical stabilizers, the front one and the one that is behind it. And you can see that some of this shading process, some of it I'm doing a little bit carelessly, like I may be rushing things a little bit, but I can subdue that texture a bit because I'm going to be working over it both with this pencil that I'm using right now and with the darker Russian blue. So you can see now how, as I'm kind of cross-hatching, working from a different angle, the texture is either disappearing on it or it is becoming a lot less noticeable. The proper way to work with these Faber-Castell polychromos pencils is to use a small circular or elliptical motion and to avoid using too much pressure. But that's for reasonable and patient people, and that's not for us. I normally use a combination of these techniques. Sometimes I just feel that I can cover some areas with a little bit less patience and with a little bit more hurry, so it's not a problem. Now in some other areas which seem a little bit more delicate, I tend to use a different approach, maybe even a tapered stroke where I can create some smoother, seamless transitions from, for example, a darker area to the lighter area, etc. Moving on to the lower part of the plane here, onto the hull and onto this area around the engines. So I'm working around the horizontal stabilizers now, and there's going to be a bit of shadow under the horizontal tail, and also some of these yellowish marks, yellowish insignia, which I don't really know what they all are, but I don't really need to know. All I have to do is stick to my reference and it'll still look fine. I probably still do know more about the parts of an airplane than an average person, because I used to study airplanes back when I was a lot younger. When I was a teenager, I was fascinated with military aircraft, especially modern fighters. So I used to read a lot about the subject. Nowadays I don't really know that much. I've forgotten a lot that I read about, and I don't really know that much about some of the newest aircraft. And of course now I'm working on the cockpit, and it has to be transparent. but because there's glass covering over it, I also need to make some indications of reflections and things like that. I'm going to simplify some of the details that I see in it, because obviously I can't make out everything in my reference photo, nor am I an expert on what the cockpit of an F-18 exactly looks like. So I did this front part, and using a bit of grey and black, and I left the white for the lightest part of the highlight. And now I'm doing the pilot's seat, and I did his helmet, which is also yellowish orange. Just going to put some indications of details on that pilot's seat. In front of the pilot there is a head-up display and the board with the instruments and the displays and stuff. But like I said, we can't really see much of that, so I simplified that a little bit. The key here with the cockpit is that this lightest part of the cockpit, the top edge, needs to stand out against the background. So I needed to create that contrast so that the cockpit would appear to be both transparent and made out of glass. And I think I have achieved that. So now I'm moving on to the nose. There's going to be a few reflective areas there as well. Again, I'm going to create those highlights by reserving the white space, but I'm also going to do a bit of erasing as well. So I skipped over a part of the drawing process here. I didn't record all of the drawing process, but let me sum up what I did. I basically worked around that highlight on the nose and created a nice transition towards it, and around the edges I worked with a Prussian blue and even added a touch of black to make that darker, because this is a round area. The part of it which is facing towards the light source is going to have a highlight and is going to be lighter than the edges. I also used a pencil eraser here and there to add some additional lighter details and to make a transition from those darker areas to the highlight. But once again, in order for the highlight to really stand out, I have to leave the white space and not cover it with any color pencil. And I also have to work around it with a sufficient amount of value so that it would really stand out, because if I don't do that, I won't have enough contrast and the highlight will not appear shiny or reflective. I'm pretty much wrapping things up with a bluish part of the background here. There is a bit of texture, I'll have to say, but I am softening that with a brush, and most of it is gone. And it's kind of acceptable because it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm thinking the aircraft in the foreground are way more detailed than the background, and that's what's going to draw the attention of the viewer immediately. So if there's any texture in the sky, it's probably going to go unnoticed for the most part. I'm doing these exhausts at the end here and adding some details. I want some parts of them to be reflective as well, but mostly greyish. So I worked with a black colored pencil there mostly. And I did a bit of work with an eraser. So here there's some insignia on the sides of the aircraft. I'm going to simplify that as well, because I can't make out all of the details, and it's way too small for me to have the room to maneuver and to draw all of these small details. I'm going to draw some more shadow here around the intakes and at the bottom of the aircraft. These shadows are super important. If I want the wings to stand out, if I want the viewer to feel like wings are protruding towards us. So another highlight here on this intake here on the side. Again, I worked around the white space. I softened the edge a little bit and then I worked around it with this phthalo blue, and then added a bit of Prussian blue on top of that, and even more of it in combination with the black for the shadow areas. So pretty much I'm repeating the same thing that I already did in several other places. And that's the Blue Angels insignia right there that I'm working on. I'm not really sure if I'm going to be able to get those letters to look nice and clean, but I think the viewer will still be able to pick up on them and still be able to understand what they say more or less, especially if they know which aircraft they're looking at. So I'm first going to draw these orange, yellowish orange letters, the Blue Angel sign, with as much precision as I can. And then I'm going to work around that. With my blue colored pencil. For these details you have to keep your pencils sharp, but the good thing about Polychromos, Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils is that they hold the tip very long. These pencils are somewhat harder and they don't need to be resharpened quite as often, and they also don't break very often, which is very good. Just a few more details here and there, and a bit more shadow under these root extensions of the wings. I'm now trying to finish the wing, but I really want it to stand out. That's why I need to define the shadows under it. So I need to color that in using that phthalo blue, make that a little bit smoother. Here on the right side I'm also putting in some details on those clouds, again dividing those larger shapes into slightly smaller shapes, adding some details to them, because these are three-dimensional objects, so I want them to look like they have an irregular looking surface, and just refining some of the edges and some of the details using a pencil eraser. And I'm going to do the same thing all the way here on the left, in the lower left corner, just defining those clouds a little bit more. Using the same colored pencil that I used for the background for the sky, that's the light phthalo blue. For some of the shadow areas in those yellowish orange parts, I also used a burnt sienna, which is like a reddish brown. It worked well for some of the darker bits in those orangey areas. Here I'm getting closer to wrapping things up. I need to define some of the darker areas here around the place where the wings are attached to the hull. So a bit more value here. to separate the wing and the root extensions. And now we have another darker area coming down here, and then sort of a transition from that darker area, from that edge towards the tip of the wing, which is going to be getting gradually lighter and lighter and lighter. And I'm working on that until I'm happy with the amount of value and with the texture, because I want to remove most of the texture. I want the aircraft to appear smooth, like it's made out of metal. It doesn't have to be perfect, there will be some texture, but so far it's not too distracting. I'm adding a bit more value around the top edge here to define the aircraft a bit better. And this is pretty much what the finished drawing looks like. I put my signature in the lower right corner. Don't forget to check out my other videos. I have other drawings of airplanes, but I have other stuff as well. I'm going to see you in the next video. I want to thank you for watching this one. That'll be all. Bye for now.